Hello everyone, my name is Aaron Woodman, and I want to welcome you to my YouTube channel. In this video, we will talk about expressing a variety of words in a dialogue. This is important because if you disagree with someone and you convey your argument, you do not want to sound too repetitive or predictable with the words you say. Hostile arguments get locked into simple and predictable patterns where the other person will know what you will say next and tune you out because it sounds like you are repeating a common talking point. This can happen the other way around, where you can tune out another person for being repetitive and using common talking points as well. Think about the debates you hear on the news shows or any political debate. If you hear them so many times, you will start to notice most of the speakers will use common talking points that align with their political viewpoints. At that point, you do not notice a lot of variety. To make a disagreement more productive, you should introduce novelty and variation. You want to be surprising so you keep the other person hooked to what you are saying and be interested in your arguments. You want to prioritize constructive conversations over destructive conversations. Let's look at some research behind this. Peter Coleman, a professor of conflict resolution, runs the Difficult Conversations Laboratory at Columbia University. Coleman and his team have analyzed hundreds of encounters between people with opposing views. They study the emotional dynamics of conversations, how they flow, and how they get stuck. Then they graph them. The lab employs a similar methodology to the one pioneered by relationship scientists. It matches strangers with strong and opposite views on a polarizing issue and invites them to talk the issue through. Afterwards, each participant is played a recording of the conversation and asked to say how he or she felt at each moment. The results are coded for positive and negative emotions and for particular thoughts and behaviors. The conversations can get heated. Sometimes they have to be brought to an end early. Others go much better. Coleman and his colleagues have identified a key difference between the more destructive conversations and the more constructive ones. The destructive conversations get locked into a tug-of-war dynamic early on and stay that way, becoming progressively more bad-tempered. Each person aligns himself with a side, and each blames the other side for the world's problems. Meanwhile, the constructive conversations are not necessarily calm or well-mannered. They can involve verbal attacks and bad-faced statements, and the participants can report feeling heard and annoyed, but at certain points, the participants are able to escape or subvert the dynamic. Positive emotions like amusement, empathy, and insight make appearances, if only fleeting ones. The conversation is more expansive. It has variety. Coleman reported, quote, the more constructive dyads thought about the issues in more complex, nuanced, and flexible ways. They felt many different types of emotions, both positive and negative, over the course of the discussions, and they behaved in more varied ways that demonstrated a greater degree of openness, flexibility, and curiosity, in addition to a strong advocacy for their positions. When Coleman's team mapped the data on the emotions of each conversation on a grid, the shapes generated by constructive and productive conversations look very different. The constructive ones are literally all over the place, messy constellations of dots. The destructive ones are straight lines. It's as if the participants in the destructive conversations have had their emotional range reduced to a narrow band. They have become wholly predictable. In session 1, destructive, the dots are tightly organized along two lines, indicating a narrow emotional range of the discussion. In session 2, constructive, the dots show that the emotions of the participants fluctuated back and forth as the discussion unfolded. Coleman measured thought and behavior as well as emotion. In every dimension, the constructive conversations were more complex than the destructive ones. Software engineers who design chatbots distinguish between stateful and stateless conversations. A stateful exchange is one in which the participants retain a memory of what is said during the conversation. Stateless dialogues are ones in which little or no conversational history is retained, and each new remark responds only to the last. They are so low context that they don't even have the context of the previous conversation. For obvious reasons, it's easier to design bots for stateless conversations. Picking an appropriate response to a single cue requires less processing power than attempting to engage with the flow of a conversation. The trade-off for programmers is that stateless bots sound robotic, dispensing pre-scripted replies without any indication that they really know what the conversation is about. But it is not as big of a trade-off as you might think, since a lot of human conversations are stateless. For example, have you ever had an argument like this? Person A, quote, I really enjoyed that book, unquote. Person B, quote, oh, really? It's very poorly written, unquote. Person A, quote, why do you have to make me feel bad about what I like, unquote. Person B, quote, why do you have to play the victim all the time, unquote. Person A, quote, oh, that's rich, you're always playing the victim, unquote. Person B, quote, look, you're clearly just in a bad mood today, unquote. Person A, quote, I'm the one in a bad mood, unquote. And so on. In an exchange like this, each remark is only about the last remark. The conversation has almost no memory of itself. Neither partner is learning anything from the other, and both are becoming increasingly bad-tempered. In 1989, an undergraduate computer programmer at the University of Dublin called Mark Humphreys wrote a chatbot program he called M-Gonzi. Whenever M-Gonzi lacked a clear cue for how to respond to a remark, it threw in an insult. When Humphreys left the program connected to his university's computer network overnight, he returned in the morning to discover that somebody had spent an hour and a half engaged in an argument with Gonzi, obviously convinced that he was debating with a real person. Humphreys had stumbled across a truth about human arguments. They tend towards statelessness. Arguments that start off as being about something quickly becomes about nothing but themselves, locking the participants into a pattern of negative reciprocation. The conversation becomes as simple and simplistic as a straight line. Stateless arguments can run on indefinitely and fruitlessly since there is nothing to solve or conclude. As they do so, they usually become more unpleasant. Like water, an argument becomes diffuse as it heats, but in this case, the resulting gas is toxic. You might forget what your argument with your partner was about, but you will probably remember how it made you feel. The science writer Brian Christian observes that, quote, verbal abuse is simply less complex than other forms of communication, unquote. Gonzis's anonymous correspondent replied to the bot's insults with insults of his own. However witty or stinging his retorts may have been, he was making things easy for the bot by restoring at all. If he just asks a few questions, he would have quickly discovered the limited range of his interlocutor. Chatbots find it nearly impossible to respond convincingly to inquiries such as, quote, what do you mean by that, unquote, and, quote, how so, unquote, because requests for elaboration rely on context. They prompt the participants to widen the conversation rather than just taking a cue from the last remark. Similarly, to make a conversation between people more human and less robotic, we need to ask questions that can't be answered with a prepared script. Hence, the crucial roles of empathy, curiosity, and surprise in conflict-written conversations. This means you should ask questions to someone on why they have a specific viewpoint and why it is important to them. Questions like these get the other person to deeply think about their actions and for you to understand where they are coming from. That is how you can make the flow sound more natural. That is the key point. You want to move beyond a script to build trust and relationships with people. We talked about authenticity many times before in this video set series, and that is key to having natural conversations with people that does not rely on talking points you drilled in their mind. Because sometimes circumstances change in the conversation and you need to be ready to adapt when that happens. You want to show that you are actually listening to the other person and respond to new points they make instead of sticking with the same talking points that might be irrelevant to the new type of conversation you are having with the person. Let's proceed into talking about facilitating creative dissonance. There is a fundamental tension in the human psyche, says Peter Coleman, between coherence and complexity. He calls it the crude law of our existence. We want resolution and closure at the same time as we want interest and novelty. We seek order and we seek freedom. Problems arise when we feel pushed too far in one direction or the other. Communities that are too ordered become stifling and oppressive. Those that have no coherence are unsettling and alienating. Mental health problems tend to resolve from an excessive drive from either order, obsessive compulsive syndrome, or chaos, schizophrenia. When we are anxious or threatened or just tired, we have a strong drive to simplify by taking shortcuts to coherence. What happens when you're in an argument with someone? You feel stressed, attacked, and weary. So you reach for even simpler answers while the other person does the same. When a conflict of any kind escalates, says Coleman, there is a press for coherence on both sides. Each party became increasingly rigid and inflexible. Nuance, irony, and compromise collapse into binary oppositions. Good versus evil, stupid versus smart. Curiosity about someone else's point of view is rendered suspect because it opens up questions we prefer to be closed down. So is empathy, which might smudge the clarity of our moral vision. The only allowable question becomes, whose side are you on? Disrupting this dynamic requires a lateral approach. Rather than going directly after a conflict, Coleman's advice is to stop making sense. Essentially, the main task is to find a way, anyway, of fostering positive feelings between the parties. Quote, this may seem simplistic, but it's everything. In fact, the more distant these attempts are from rational persuasion and from obvious attempts at swaying emotions, the better, unquote. For instance, negotiators are trained to analyze and rationalize. They think in straight lines, but when straight lines are the problem, what's required is imagination. That's where they need to adapt their statements to meet the new circumstance, or else they will look like they have no idea what they are talking about. This same concept applies to all of us in our everyday conversations with people, because one of us can say something unexpected, and both of us need to adapt our statements to meet the new circumstances, so we keep the flow natural. Let's talk about switching of words and arguments. Peter Coleman cites a study which estimates that about 1 in 20 conflicts are classified as intractable, that is extremely hard to solve. The figure is said to apply not just to diplomatic and political clashes, but to the conflicts of everyday life between family members, friends, or colleagues. Intractable disputes may be rare, but they exert a powerful influence over the lives of the participants and those around them, draining energy and generating hostility. We are used to referring to them as complex, but in a sense, as we have seen, the problem is the opposite, which implies something about how to approach them. As Coleman says, quote, in conflict, you are pulled to simplify, and so you need to offset it with more complexity of feeling, thought, and action. Arguments with our friends and relatives often follow regular patterns. Once the argument begins, you can predict how things will unfold, like an expert chess player can predict the next 8 moves in a game from a glance at the board. As the familiar script plays out, we find ourselves almost irresistibly swept along with it. To stop this from happening, mix things up by saying what the other person isn't expecting you to say, agreeing on something unexpectedly, or switching topics for a while. You could vary how you say things as well as what you say, the language you use, and the one you deploy. It might be a note of humor or a touch of warmth, or even just something that doesn't quite make sense. For example, if you always have the argument in the kitchen or in an office, find somewhere else to have it out. When you are trying to do what you're trying to do is create space, literally and figuratively, for a new way of communicating with each other. Because again, if you keep doing or saying the same thing so many times, it becomes boring, repetitive, and less engaging. In disagreements, you want to have the conversation be engaging, so you are learning new things and solving problems. That is why it is important to have a variety in them. In conclusion, when conversations become repetitive and scripted, they turn into stateless exchanges where no one is really listening and no one is learning new information. That is when arguments spiral, relationships get strained, and both sides walk away feeling like they learned nothing new. The research shows that constructive conversations look very different. They are dynamic, emotions shift, curiosity shows up. People step outside rigid talking points and respond to what is actually being said in the moment. Even when the discussion is heated, there are signals of empathy, humor, insight, or openness that break the tug of war pattern and make real understanding possible. So the goal in a disagreement is not just to defend your position, but to add variety to help enhance your position in your conversational exchange with someone. You could do this by asking questions that invite explanation from the other person. Show that you are listening by adapting to new information that gets expressed in a conversation. Be willing to surprise the other person by acknowledging one of their points, shifting your tone, or introducing a fresh perspective. These small moments of variety and authenticity can disrupt negative cycles and create space for more meaningful dialogue. When we move beyond scripts and predictable talking points, conversations become less robotic and more human. That is where trust grows, learning happens, and turns disagreements into a connection. In the next video, we will talk about setting agreed norms and boundaries before a conversation. Until then, please like this video, subscribe to my YouTube channel, and turn on the post notifications so you will be notified when I post my next video. I appreciate your support. Remember, you are powerful, you are capable, and you are the changemaker our society needs. Thank you so much for watching this video. I will see you soon.